They called themselves HOA cops. Not real police, not even security licensed by the state, just a group of overconfident neighborhood enforcers with badges they bought online. And for some reason, they kept parking their big black trucks on our land, on my grandpa's ranch, right on the edge of the old cattle gate. They said it was part of their patrol route, but no one in their right mind would believe that, especially not my grandfather. Now, Grandpa isn't the kind of man who gets rattled easily. He's the opposite. Quiet, calm, and tough as rusted iron. A Vietnam vet. A rancher for over 50 years. He raised cattle, not excuses. So when he told the HOA that the private road cutting through the ridge was still part of his ranch, he expected they'd respect that. He had deeds, maps, history. His family had owned that land before the HOA even existed. But the HOA didn't care. They acted like they owned everything in sight. At first, it was small things. One of their cops parked near our barn while texting on his phone. Then they'd swing around our water tanks and leave tracks on the slope after a storm. But soon, it turned into a habit. Every other morning, one of them would stop their SUV near the pasture, put on some sunglasses, and just sit there watching, like they were waiting for someone to step out of line. Grandpa didn't like it. Not one bit. He didn't like being watched, and he didn't like strangers thinking they had power where they didn't. One morning, I remember Grandpa walking out to them with a cup of coffee in his hand. He stayed calm, told them they were trespassing, even offered to show the property line. The guy in the car barely looked up, just smirked and said, "HOA business." That was the moment I saw it in Grandpa's eyes. He knew reasoning was pointless. A week later, one of their trucks parked just inches from Grandpa's irrigation line. He had spent days laying that pipe, a whole morning under the sun, his knees in the dirt, and this oversized decal-covered vehicle was now resting right on top of it. The tires cracked with the joints. Water was leaking into the soil. And they didn't care. When we brought up, the HOA president sent an email with a smiley face emoji and a vague line about shared boundaries. That's when Grandpa stopped talking about it. He didn't write letters, didn't call anyone, didn't go to the HOA meetings. He just started planning. You could tell. He was up early, walking around the border of the ranch with a little notepad in his shirt pocket. He stood by the fence longer than usual, measured things, dug a few holes. When I asked him what he was doing, he just said, "Making adjustments." The weirdest part? One afternoon, I saw him loading empty paint cans into the bed of his truck. Not full, just the cans, along with some of those yellow flags utility companies use to mark underground lines. I asked if we had a gas leak. He didn't even blink. Just said, "Nope, just want to send a message." That night, after dinner, he walked out with a hammer and a few metal signs he printed himself. Bright red letters, hand-drilled onto wooden stakes. Caution, live mines in area. It wasn't just one. He planted a dozen of those signs along the dirt path where the HOA trucks kept creeping through. And in between the signs, he stuck those yellow flags deep into the ground, as if each one marked something hidden, dangerous, official-looking. They weren't real landmines, of course. But Grandpa never told them that. He made sure the path looked like a field from a military manual. Old barrels half buried, plastic cords sticking out of the soil. And then he waited. No cameras, no yelling, no drama, just quiet. The next morning, the HOA patrol didn't show up. The morning after that, still no trucks. A week passed, then two, and suddenly, the HOA cops who thought they ruled the land weren't even driving near the ranch. Whatever Grandpa had created scared them more than any warning ever could. And you know what's funny? Every sign was technically legal. He didn't say there were mines, just that people should be cautious. And since it was private land, no one could take them down. But that wasn't the end of it, not by a long shot, because the HOA didn't like losing control. And they were about to make a mistake much bigger than trespassing. After the signs went up, it was like someone flipped a switch. The ranch that once had SUVs loitering near the fences turned completely quiet. Grandpa's land turned into a ghost zone. Not a single tire mark. Not a single patrol. The fake HOA cops had vanished. But that silence, it wasn't peace. It was tension. The kind of stillness before a thunderstorm rolls in. It started subtly. A strange white pickup drove past our gate 3 times in one morning. Slower each time. No HOA logos on the doors, but you could tell it wasn't just a neighbor. Then came a drone, just buzzing faintly over the property one evening while I was locking the chicken coop. It hovered over the field with the warning signs, spun in place, then zipped away like a wasp. Grandpa stood on the porch, arms crossed, watching it with that same unreadable stare. He didn't say a word. 2 days later, the HOA sent a letter, not a normal envelope. This one was thick, typed, and official-looking. It had one of those stamped logos that tries too hard to look like government paperwork. It basically accused Grandpa of creating hazardous conditions within the shared community zone. Whatever that meant, they demanded immediate removal of any and all simulated or implied explosive materials. Grandpa read the letter out loud in the kitchen while sipping his tea, like he was reading the weather report. No reaction. When he got to the end, he folded the paper, slid it into the toaster oven, and turned the knob to medium brown. That was his way of filing things. The next day, they escalated. The HOA board sent someone in person, a man in a tan blazer and polished shoes. Definitely not ranch wear. He stood just outside the fence line, careful not to cross the property line, like he knew better. He had a clipboard in one hand and a camera slung over his shoulder. I watched from the barn while Grandpa strolled down the hill toward him, calm as ever, chewing on a stalk of grass. The guy introduced himself as the HOA safety coordinator, said he was there to assess the threat level and make sure no residents were endangered. Grandpa just asked him one question. "Are you standing on my land?" The man paused, looked down at the soil under his feet, stepped back, and said, "No, sir, I'm on the public right-of-way." Grandpa nodded. "Then you can speak all you want." The coordinator talked for a while, asked questions, tried to be friendly. But Grandpa didn't offer much in return, just stared, arms folded. And when Guy finally asked if the landmines were real, Grandpa said, "I don't see how that's your business if you're not planning on stepping over the fence." The man's face twitched. He didn't say much after that. He left in a hurry. That same week, we started getting flyers in the mailbox. Bright red, bold letters. Community warning. Dangerous materials on property near you. There was a blurry picture of Grandpa's signs and a paragraph telling neighbors to report any suspicious activity. They were trying to make Grandpa out to be some kind of lunatic survivalist. But everyone around here knew better. Our neighbors had lived next to Grandpa for decades. They knew he was firm, but fair. If he put those signs up, it meant someone had pushed too far. Still, the pressure didn't stop. Next came the security company. Not the HOA's usual rent-a-cop guys, but a private contractor. Black vehicles with tinted windows. They parked just outside the property again, but this time they didn't linger. One walked around the fence perimeter taking notes. Another used a long pole with a mirror to check under things. They acted like they were prepping for a raid. That night, Grandpa moved the signs. Not removed, just moved. Deeper into the property. No explanation, just quiet shifting. A few barrels repositioned, a few flags added. The kind of thing that made it look like something was hidden where nothing really was. It was all suggestion, fear by design. The HOA didn't know what was real and what wasn't, and that drove them crazy. They couldn't prove anything because there was nothing illegal on the surface. But they also didn't dare call the real cops, because if law enforcement came in and found no explosives, the HOA would look like fools for admitting they were afraid of signs and empty paint cans. So they stewed, and they waited. But Grandpa, he just kept tending his land like normal, fixing fences, watering trees, and letting the idea of landmines do all the talking. It was only a matter of time before someone cracked. And when they did, they'd learn exactly what kind of man they were dealing with. The first crack didn't come from the HOA boardroom. It came from one of their so-called enforcers, a younger guy, maybe late 20s, with a buzz cut and a face that tried way too hard to look serious. He wasn't wearing a uniform this time, just a black polo shirt with a tiny badge stitched over the chest. But the attitude, still the same. He pulled up one afternoon, stopped just past the HOA's boundary, and sat there with the engine running. Windows up, sunglasses on, like he was daring someone to come out and tell him to leave. But nobody did. Grandpa was up in the hayloft, stacking bales like nothing was going on. I was fixing a latch on the goat pen and watching quietly. The guy waited 15 minutes, then stepped out of the truck. He didn't go near the fence, didn't yell. He just started filming. A slow pan across our property, the barrels, the flags, the signs. He zoomed in like he was collecting evidence. I could feel my blood pressure rising just watching him act like we were the criminals. But Grandpa, he didn't move a muscle, just let him film. Then something odd happened. The man reached into his truck and pulled out a measuring wheel, the kind you roll along the ground to measure distance. He carefully walked up to the edge of the fence and started measuring how far back the signs were placed. He didn't step onto the ranch, but he came close enough to make his intentions clear. He wasn't here to talk. He was here to build a case. That evening, Grandpa went out back and came back with an old military ammo crate. Not a real one anymore. It was empty, just used for storing tools. But it looked authentic. Rusted latches, government markings. He placed it right near one of the fake minefield zones and sprinkled a bit of dry dirt around it like it had been sitting there for years. Then he leaned a broken rake against it and walked away like it was nothing. The next morning, 2 HOA trucks showed up, not just parked. They rolled in like they owned the place, but stopped short at the property line. 4 guys stepped out, all wearing those fake uniforms, badges clipped to belts, radios on their shoulders. This time, they weren't pretending to be subtle. They started filming everything. One of them shouted over the fence, "You can't threaten people with bombs." Oh man. Grandpa stood by the barn and just looked at them, calm, unmoved. He said, "Did you see any bombs?" One of the guys replied, "You know what you're doing? You're scaring people. We've had complaints." Grandpa nodded and said, maybe they should stop parking on other people's land. That was it. No yelling, no long speech, just facts. But here's the kicker. One of those men must have stepped too close, because suddenly one of the signs, the one staked closest to gravel, tipped over, just from a gust of wind maybe, or a boot nudge. But it spooked them bad. You should have seen it. All 4 of them jumped back like it was about to explode. One of them yelled, "We need backup," into his radio, even though no one else came. They scrambled into their trucks, wheels spinning dirt behind them, and drove off like they'd seen a ghost. That night, Grandpa chuckled for the first time in weeks. He sat on the porch with his old dog and said, "They're bluffing, and I'm better at it." That's the thing. This was never about violence, never about real minds. It was psychological. He played the long game. He let them feel the tension they'd been causing everyone else. Still, the HOA couldn't let it go. They were too proud, too used to everyone bowing to their fake authority. And the worst part? They started turning the neighbors against us. Quietly, subtly. First, it was the rumors, whispers about Grandpa being unstable. Then a neighbor down the road refused to sell him hay, saying he didn't want to get involved in any trouble. Even a local mechanic, who'd always given us a fair deal, suddenly acted distant. But Grandpa didn't react. He just kept tending the ranch like nothing had changed. Fixed the fence, cleared brush, fed the animals. His silence made them nervous, because deep down, they knew they'd messed with the wrong man. And that's when things really took a turn. Not on our side of the fence, but on theirs. It started with a sudden drop in HOA patrols. The usual black trucks that used the circle like vultures didn't show up anymore. The clipboard guy? Gone. The fake badge wearers? Disappeared. For about a week, it felt like they had finally backed off. Like maybe someone in their chain of command finally realized they were out of their depth. But Grandpa didn't relax. He didn't smile. He knew better. Then one morning, just after sunrise, I found Grandpa standing by the south fence line, staring down at fresh tire marks in the dirt. The grass was crushed. Deep treads from a heavy vehicle. Too wide for a regular pickup. Too shallow for farm equipment. Whatever came through had rolled in late, parked for a while, then backed out again. No cameras. No warnings. No calls. Just silence. Grandpa didn't say a word. He followed the tracks with his eyes and then slowly turned to look up toward the hill where the old water tower stood. That was our highest point. Gave a full view of the lower pasture and the fake minefield. Something had been watching. He could feel it. Later that afternoon, the mail came, but it wasn't just letters this time. There was a manila envelope stuffed into our box with no return address. Inside was a printed photo, grainy and zoomed in, someone had taken from a distance. But the subject was unmistakable. It was Grandpa, kneeling beside one of the barrels he'd placed weeks earlier, hammer in hand. The back of his shirt was soaked with sweat. The picture had been taken without his knowledge. Taped to the back of the photo was a note, typed in all caps. "The next move isn't yours." I showed Grandpa the picture. He looked at it once, then tucked it behind a stack of old feed catalogs on the counter. No words. Just that steady look in his eye, like a man flipping through his mental playbook. He'd seen this kind of bluff before, just not in a neighborhood with lawn signs and potlucks. That evening, he pulled a tarp off the old hunting Jeep we hadn't used in years. The tires were flat, the seat cushions cracked, but the engine still turned. By nightfall, he had it running again, not for driving, just for visibility. He parked it near the front gate with the headlights aimed straight down the main dirt path, the same route the fake cops had used to sneak onto the ranch. The next morning, someone knocked on our door. Not a neighbor, not HOA. This man wore a collared shirt with a badge clipped up front and had a calm but official tone. Real law enforcement, county sheriff's department. He asked if he could ask a few questions about a report from a neighborhood association. Grandpa offered him a seat on the porch. The sheriff didn't accuse him of anything, not directly. Just said there had been concerns about public safety, and that someone had mentioned possible explosives. Grandpa calmly replied, "If anyone finds any explosives, they're welcome to show them to me. Until then, we're just talking about signs and barrels on my own land." The sheriff nodded slowly, clearly realizing what was going on. Before he left, he lowered his voice and said, "Off the record, you've got some powerful enemies up the hill. Be careful how you play this." Grandpa just said, "I don't play," and that was that. The next phase came fast. Late-night noises, lights flashing behind the tree line, our dogs barking at nothing. One night, we found a broken piece of drone on the roof, shattered plastic, and a cracked lens. Someone had been trying to watch us again. But the thing had either malfunctioned or Grandpa's newly installed radio jammer, the one he didn't officially admit to owning, had done its job. And still, through it all, Grandpa kept reinforcing the perimeter. He wasn't digging real holes or laying traps, but he made it look like he was. More signs, more barrels, bits of wire strung near the ground, leading to nothing. Things that made even a seasoned intruder think twice. One morning, we woke to find all the HOA signage on their side of the fence had been torn down. Not broken, removed, replaced with new ones, written in cold, formal legal language. Private enforcement zone, all visitors subject to search, and HOA authorized access only. It wasn't just a reaction. It was a warning. They were regrouping. Whatever they were planning, it wasn't over. Not even close. Grandpa had outplayed them for now. But when the HOA feels powerless, it doesn't back down. It gets desperate, and desperate people make reckless decisions. 3 days later, something strange happened. One of the HOA's patrol trucks came back, but not with the usual arrogance. It rolled in slow, cautious, headlights off even though it was nearly dusk. Instead of parking outside the property like before, it pulled just a few feet beyond the boundary line and stopped, engine idling. 2 men sat inside. One of them held a tablet up to the window, aiming it at the ranch like he was scanning something. From the porch, I watched it all unfold. Grandpa stood beside me, arms crossed. He didn't grab his shotgun or even raise his voice. He just muttered, "They're mapping now. Try to figure out where they can step without getting burned." I didn't understand at first. Mapping what? But Grandpa wasn't talking about terrain. He was talking about fear. They weren't planning an actual raid. They were trying to build confidence again, trying to test which parts of the bluff were safe to ignore. That night, Grandpa stayed up late. I could hear the sounds from the barn, wood clanking, tools clattering, the occasional curse word under his breath. By the time morning came, 3 new posts had been hammered into the ground along the main path. No signs this time, just tall wooden stakes, painted red at the top. They didn't say a word, but their message was loud and clear. Cross here, and you're taking your chances. By noon, word had spread around the neighborhood. One of the HOA board members, a man named Cole, who always wore a bow tie and drove a hybrid car, was seen pacing nervously outside the community clubhouse. Apparently, he received an anonymous email with a satellite photo showing the stakes, circled in red, and a caption that simply read, "Zone activated." No one knew who sent it, but everyone assumed it was Grandpa. Later that day, a group of residents gathered at the edge of the HOA zone. I recognized a few of them, people who'd once waved when driving past, now standing stiff, arms crossed, eyes darting toward our ranch like it was radioactive. One woman even pulled out binoculars, like we were animals behind a fence. The line between us and them had never been more visible. But while most of the HOA was shaking in their overpriced boots, one man wasn't. His name was Hutch, a former contractor, loudmouth, and self-declared security expert. He wasn't part of the official HOA board, but they relied on him like a blunt instrument. He'd shown up to previous disputes around the neighborhood before, usually with threats, occasionally with tools. So when his lifted truck rolled up that evening, we knew trouble was coming. Hutch didn't stop outside the property line like the others. He drove straight up to the front gate, parked with one tire barely touching the edge of our gravel, then stepped out with that cocky grin he always wore when he thought he had the upper hand. He had a GoPro strapped to his chest and a walkie-talkie on his belt. Everything about him screamed, "I'm here to make a scene." Grandpa didn't meet him right away. He waited, let Hutch stew a little. Finally, he walked down the slope slow, like time itself didn't matter. Hutch started barking almost immediately. We all know those signs are fake. "Old man, you can't terrorize people with pretend landmines. This ain't a movie set." His voice carried, and I could see a few people watching from the row behind. Cameras out, filming everything. Grandpa said nothing for a moment, just looked at the GoPro and said, "Hope that camera's bulletproof." Hutch froze, not because of the words, but the tone. Calm, steady, like he wasn't bluffing. Then Grandpa did something I didn't expect. He pulled out a small, black remote from his pocket, raised it slowly, clicked a button. And somewhere deep on the property, not near Hutch, but far off to the west field, a loud bang rang out. Not an explosion, but a controlled detonation, just enough to rattle every bone in Hutch's body. He jumped, nearly fell backward, then scrambled his truck without saying another word. Tires spun, dirt flew, and just like that, the self-declared security expert was gone. That one sound changed everything. The HOA's confidence cracked. They didn't know what Grandpa had hidden. They didn't even care if it was real anymore. The risk was too big, the embarrassment too close. And from that moment on, they stopped showing up in person. But something else replaced them. Something far worse. The next phase wasn't boots on the ground. It was paper. Thin white envelopes started arriving like clockwork. First 1, then 2, then 5, all from the same return address, the HOA's legal department. Each one came with a fancy header, gold lettering, and a threatening tone dressed up in polite legalese. Cease and desist. Public safety hazard. Violation of municipal codes. Unlawful intimidation of HOA personnel. The stack grew taller each day. Grandpa didn't read them at first. He just tossed them onto the kitchen table like junk mail. But I read a few, and I'll tell you what they really were. Scare tactics. Carefully worded threats, hoping he'd panic and tear down the signs, pull up the barrels, maybe even apologize. But Grandpa had been through real wars. These were just alphabet games. Then came the big one, a formal notice claiming the HOA was filing an emergency injunction to gain temporary administrative access to the ranch. That's right. They were trying to go through the court to get legal permission to come onto our land, under the excuse of public safety. The irony? The same people who'd been trespassing, spying, and harassing were now begging a judge to let them legally cross the fence. Grandpa didn't get mad. He got organized. He pulled out a dusty box from the back closet, old maps, original deeds, land surveys, and copies of his veterans' property tax exemptions. Everything the county ever stamped, he kept. Everything the ranch had touched, from water rights to airspace. He laid them out on the table, like playing cards. Then he called a lawyer. Not just any lawyer, but an old friend he served with, now semi-retired and still as sharp as a tack. By the next morning, a response letter had been sent back. Simple, firm, and signed in ink. It stated clearly that the land was private, had never been part of the HOA district, and that any unauthorized access would be treated as trespassing. Period. No wiggle room. No apologies. But the HOA didn't back down. They doubled down. Someone we never saw who started posting flyers around town. Rancher threatens community safety, they read. Below the headline were pictures, old images of the signs, the barrels. Even a blurred photo of Grandpa holding the remote from that day Hutch showed up. It was taken from a distance, probably by a drone or someone with a long lens. The implication was clear. Grandpa was dangerous, mentally unstable, a risk. People started whispering again. The feed store manager asked if we were doing okay. A neighbor who used to stop and chat now drove past with windows up and eyes forward. Even the postman started leaving the mail further from the gate. Then one night, someone crossed a line. We found tire tracks in the dark, soft dirt by the eastern fence, the one furthest from the road. They hadn't come in deep, just enough to leave a mark and spook us. But next to those tracks was something worse. One of our warning signs had been snapped in half and left lying in the grass. No note, no tag, just a message. Silent, brazen. Grandpa took his time fixing it. Not just the sign, the message behind it. This time he used steel, bolted it to a concrete footing, dug deeper, painted it black with bright white letters. You've been seen. Leave now. Asterisk, asterisk, it wasn't just a bluff anymore. It was a declaration. And maybe that's what finally tipped the scales, because 2 days later, the county showed up, not one officer, a whole team, real deputies, real uniforms. They didn't come in with sirens or threats. They came with a court order, not from the HOA, but from a judge downtown. They said there had been a formal request for property evaluation regarding possible threats to public infrastructure. In short, the HOA had gone above the county, tried to pull state-level strings. But they didn't count on what Grandpa had waiting. When the deputies stepped onto property, they were calm, respectful, even apologetic. They expected chaos. What they got was documentation. Grandpa handed over folders, copies, notarized records. Even a short video he made explaining every landmine was a visual deterrent, not an actual explosive. The barrels were filled with sand. The wires were fake. It was theater, legal, controlled, and private. The deputies didn't stay long. They took notes. They asked a few questions. One of them even smirked and said, "Honestly, sir, this is smarter than half the security systems we see." Then they left. But the damage to the HOA's plan? It was just beginning. A few mornings later, everything felt still. The kind of stillness that makes you double-check the locks and look over your shoulder even when nothing seems wrong. The fake patrol trucks hadn't been by in days. No new letters. No drones. Even the gossip trail went cold. But Grandpa wasn't fooled. "Silence is just noise waiting its turn," he muttered, sipping his black coffee, staring out toward the hills like the dirt itself was planning something. He was right. Later that same afternoon, I got a text from a friend who worked at the county records office. Asterisk, "You guys made the news." Asterisk, that sentence hit harder than it should have. I opened the link. It wasn't some local blog or gossip thread. It was a major news outlet with a full article titled, "Small Town Rancher Sparks Controversy with Landmine Defense Against HOA Intrusion." They painted the whole story like Grandpa was some unhinged loner, too stubborn to accept modern development. The article skipped over the fake cops, the constant trespassing, the threats, the late-night surveillance. It focused only on the barrels, the signs, the single fake detonation, describing it as a dangerous escalation and suggesting Grandpa may pose a risk to community peace. Photos were embedded too. Close-ups, not just of the warning signs, but of Grandpa himself. Blurry screenshots from security footage in grainy frames likely captured by the HOA's drones. One picture showed him tightening a bolt on one of the barrels, his eyes squinting in the sun. They made him look like a villain. But here's what really flipped the script. The comments, thousands of them, and to our surprise, most weren't against us. People from across the country chimed in. Asterisk. HOAs think they're above the law. This guy's a legend. Asterisk. Asterisk. I'd love to see someone try this in my neighborhood. Asterisk. Asterisk. Private land is private land. They messed around and found out. Asterisk. Some even called him Landmine Grandpa. The nickname stuck. Within hours, memes started popping up. Someone edited a photo of Grandpa standing in front of a tank with a caption, "When HOA finds meet World War II energy." Another showed a Photoshop of him in a video game cover, like a grizzled action hero. But it wasn't all jokes. The media firestorm triggered something bigger. People started digging deeper into the HOA's actions. A few internet sleuths connected the dots and discovered the private security firm the HOA used wasn't properly licensed. A former employee posted screenshots of internal emails, admitting the patrols were instructed to pressure the rancher into cooperation. Suddenly, the HOA wasn't just losing face, they were getting exposed. And just like that, the HOA board tried to shift the narrative. Cole, the bow tie guy, went on local radio, claiming they never meant to escalate and that the entire situation had been misunderstood due to misinformation online. He tried to sound calm, reasonable, but the internet doesn't forget. Meanwhile, Grandpa stayed quiet. He didn't post, didn't tweet, didn't argue with strangers. Instead, he built a new fence. Taller, stronger, reinforced, not out of fear, but to make a point. This is mine. Still mine. But here's where it got weird. A black SUV showed up near dusk. No logos. No tags. Parked just outside the gate. Engine humming. A tall man in a gray suit stepped out, clipboard in hand. No smile. He didn't even walk up to the house. He stood right at the edge of the property line and waited. Grandpa walked down slowly. Didn't say a word at first. The man introduced himself as a representative of a property development group working closely with the HOA. Said he wanted to talk solutions. No camera, no audience, just a private conversation. Grandpa listened without interrupting. The man said things like, asterisk, we could offer compensation. Asterisk, asterisk, there's potential for partnership. Asterisk, asterisk, this land has value beyond your current use. Asterisk. In other words, they wanted him to sell, to give up the ranch, to move on, probably with a fat check in hand and a non-disclosure agreement stapled to it. Grandpa tilted his head and asked one question. You think I've done all this just to walk away now? The man didn't answer. Instead, he handed Grandpa a business card and said, just think about it before the next phase begins. Then he left, and that card, it didn't go in the trash. Grandpa slid it into the front pocket of his old leather jacket, tucked it beside a folded map of the property, not because he was interested, but because he knew something bigger was coming. Something no sign or fake landmine could stop. And the next move would require something different entirely.